March 10, 1944. Occupied France. The night was moonless, the road little more than a scar through the countryside. A young woman, scarcely older than 20, pushed the pedals of her bicycle against the chill wind. Each creak of the chain echoed in her ears like a warning. In the wicker basket rested nothing more than bread and a folded shawl. At least, that was the disguise. Beneath them lay coded messages, written in invisible ink, bound for a resistance safe house. If the Gestapo stopped her, she would not live to see the dawn. She rode past silent farmhouses, their shutters drawn against the curfew. In the distance, a German patrol car hummed. Her hands tightened on the handlebars, her breath shallow. A flash of torchlight swept the hedgerow. She kept her eyes down, heart pounding, and passed without a word. Somewhere, in a hidden cellar, fighters waited for the words she carried. Thousands of miles east, another night carried its own terror. On a hospital train rattling westward from the Ukrainian front, German nurses prepared for another flood of wounded. The air stank of disinfectant and blood. Stretcher-bearers shouted over the clatter of wheels as carriages filled with men missing arms, legs, or hope. A nurse adjusted the bandage of a soldier no older than her brother. His lips trembled. "Will I go home?" he whispered. She hesitated, then pressed his hand and whispered back, "Yes." These scenes unfolded in silence, unseen by generals, yet vital to the machinery of war. Women had become couriers, nurses, clerks, and even spies, living shadows within Hitler's Europe. Their battle was not waged with rifles, but with resilience, secrecy, and compassion. Each bicycle ride, each coded message, each bandaged wound was a defiance against the Reich's grip. The paradox was sharp. The regime that glorified male strength had turned, out of desperation, to young women. They were promised duty, honor, and sacrifice. In truth, they carried burdens heavier than propaganda admitted. The girl on the bicycle knew capture meant torture. The nurse on the train knew that every soldier she saved might be sent back to fight again. Still, they pressed forward, because not pressing forward meant surrendering to despair. Across Europe, thousands of such women acted in the margins of history. French girls slipped notes inside baguettes. Polish couriers hid pistols under shawls. German auxiliaries tapped out coded messages in bunkers as artillery shook the walls. Each acted within a system that sought to crush individuality, yet their choices, silent, unrecorded, shaped the tide of war. The night in France deepened. The young cyclist reached a crossroads, dismounted, and knocked 3 times on a barn door. A man answered, took the envelope from her basket, and disappeared without a word. She turned her bicycle back toward the village, knowing that her mission had succeeded, at least for tonight. The war of women was a hidden one, smuggled in baskets, whispered in field hospitals, endured in the endless repetition of factory shifts. To generals, these figures remained nameless. But in reality, they were the sinews that bound armies, the nerves that carried messages, the hands that stitched life back together when it seemed irreparably broken. This was the shadow front of March 1944. A war fought not with tanks, but with resolve. A war where ordinary women, placed in extraordinary circumstances, became soldiers of survival. And as the night gave way to dawn, their stories, rarely told, were already shaping the end of Hitler's empire. The war had not begun with women in uniform. Yet by 1942, the transformation was unmistakable. Germany's colossal losses on the Eastern Front had drained its manpower. Entire generations of young men were swallowed by Stalingrad and Kursk, leaving the Reich scrambling to fill the gaps. The answer, paradoxically, lay in the very group Hitler had once consigned to home and hearth. Through the Reichsarbeitsdienst, young German women were ordered from classrooms into service. They were given shovels before they ever held pens again, and later typewriters, medical kits, and anti-aircraft binoculars. In barracks across the Reich, Girls no older than 18 were drilled in discipline. They learned to operate switchboards, to track Allied bombers across the sky, to bandage wounds in field hospitals. Many wore the gray uniforms of Flakhelferinnen, posted on rooftops with headphones clamped to their ears, scanning the night for engines in the dark. One recalled in her diary, "We were told we were as vital as the soldiers themselves. We believed it, until the first bombs fell." But this mobilization was not confined to Germany. Across occupied Europe, women who had never imagined holding a weapon found themselves on the front lines of resistance. In Warsaw, university students turned couriers, strapping pistols beneath their skirts. In Paris, secretaries slipped microfilm into lipstick tubes. In the Netherlands, housewives prepared safe houses, whispering to their children never to repeat what they heard. The shift was often brutal and sudden. A Polish girl who once studied Chopin found herself carrying grenades for the Armia Krajowa. A Dutch schoolteacher, arrested for hiding Jewish children, later told her interrogators, "I was never a soldier, but I could not remain only a civilian." For many, the transformation began not with ideology, but with loss. Families shattered by deportation or bombings left women with choices narrowed to silence or defiance. And so, civilians became combatants, not by rifle, but by necessity. In one testimony from France, a courier described the first time she carried a coded message. "I was terrified. My hands shook as I held the paper. But then I thought, if they catch me, better me than the others." Each act of courage, however small, pulled them deeper into a conflict that erased the boundary between the home front and the battlefield. The Reich's propaganda machine painted images of heroic German women, smiling in uniform as they supported their soldiers. Posters declared, "Women's hands strengthen Germany." But reality was harsher. Uniforms did not shield them from hunger, danger, or the trauma of watching endless streams of wounded men. In the East, nurses on hospital trains cleaned blood with frozen water, their breath misting over shattered bodies. In the West, flak auxiliaries stared skyward, knowing that the bombers they tracked meant death falling upon their own cities. For the women of the resistance, the risk was even greater. The Gestapo's grip tightened with every passing month. Interrogations were merciless, and survival often meant silence. A French teenager captured with forged documents later confessed in her diary that the silence of her cell was worse than the threat of execution. Still, her comrades carried on, smuggling intelligence through occupied streets. By 1944, the paradox of women in war was clear. Many still thought of themselves as civilians, yet their roles bore all the weight of combat. They carried the wounded from rubble, deciphered enemy transmissions, and passed messages that determined life or death for entire units. They were neither fully recognized as soldiers nor protected as civilians. They existed in the blurred no-man's land of total war, and yet, in that gray zone, they became indispensable. The Reich needed their hands. The resistance needed their courage. Their own survival depended on their ability to adapt, to shed innocence, and to accept a burden they had never sought. From Berlin's training schools to Warsaw's cellars, from Normandy's fields to the forests of the Ardennes, women stepped from the shadows of civilian life into the glaring firelight of combat. Not all carried rifles, but all carried the war upon their shoulders. Their transformation set the stage for what was to come, the direct confrontation, where the hidden war of women collided with the relentless machinery of Hitler's Reich and the advancing Allies. War was not won only on the battlefields of Normandy or the ruins of Stalingrad. It was also fought in whispered exchanges, secret signals, and messages carried by those least expected to be enemies of the Reich. Women became the lifeline of resistance intelligence networks, threading together the invisible veins of sabotage and survival. In occupied France, Odette Sansom, later Heloise, was parachuted in under the cover of night as a British Special Operations executive agent. Her mission was to organize sabotage cells and funnel intelligence back to London. She traveled under false identities, posing as an ordinary civilian. Yet each time she stepped into the street, she knew she walked inches from discovery. Arrest came eventually, and the Gestapo demanded she betray her comrades. She refused, whispering through broken lips after torture, "I have one life, and it belongs to my country." Another figure, Violette Sabo, was just 23 when she took her place among the SOE's daring women. Fluent in French, she carried weapons and instructions into occupied territory. On her final mission in 1944, she fought with a Sten gun to cover her comrades' retreat, before being captured and later executed at Ravensbrück. Her courage illuminated the paradox. Those the Reich dismissed as harmless women could, in a single act, alter the rhythm of war across Poland. Young couriers carried pistols and coded letters beneath loaves of bread. Disguised as peasants or nurses, they passed through checkpoints, their lives balanced on a soldier's suspicion. One survivor recalled the pounding of her heart as a German officer lifted the bread from her basket, set it down again, and waved her on, unaware that grenades lay hidden beneath. Even in the heart of Berlin, espionage flourished. Secretaries employed in Nazi offices copied files by candlelight, slipping intelligence to Allied handlers. They heard the boasts of officers who believed themselves untouchable, and with careful hands they carried those secrets out in handbags or coat linings. One Gestapo report later admitted that the enemy has exploited our underestimation of women, an acknowledgement of how deeply this miscalculation had cost them. The methods were endless, the courage unrelenting. Some sent coded radio signals from farmhouses, their transmitters hidden under haystacks. Others left chalk marks on walls or laundry hung in subtle patterns to guide Allied pilots. A single misstep, a wrong signal, a letter left unsecured, meant death not just for themselves, but for entire resistance cells. Gestapo interrogation rooms bore witness to this hidden war. Women agents, captured and bound to chairs, faced questions punctuated by blows. Many broke. Some did not. A diary recovered after the war described the silence of a French woman under questioning. She spoke only her name, and then no more. They could not break her. Such testimonies revealed the brutality of the system and the extraordinary resolve it sought to crush. The paradox lay in the very invisibility of these women. Considered less suspicious, they moved where men could not. A bicycle carrying a basket of bread aroused little notice, yet inside could be maps, explosives, or coded instructions. The Reich's blindness became a weapon in itself. Their efforts shaped the battlefield in unseen ways. Rail lines sabotaged by intelligence-directed missions delayed German reinforcements to Normandy. Reports smuggled out of occupied cities guided Allied bombers toward vital targets. A secretary's stolen file could save thousands of lives by exposing troop deployments. But the cost was immense. Many of these women never returned. Some disappeared into camps, their names scratched on prison walls as the only trace of their defiance. Others were executed, their final words carried in whispers to those who survived. Still, their stories endure, revealing how the shadows of war were not passive places, but arenas of immense courage. The hidden war of espionage was as relentless as any battle fought with tanks or artillery. It was fought in kitchens, barns, and back alleys, in codebooks and whispered instructions, in the silence of those who would not betray their comrades. Women turned the Reich's arrogance into a weapon, and, in doing so, became indispensable to the tide that would eventually overwhelm it. War demanded fighters on every front, but not all carried rifles. Some wielded bandages, scalpels, and morphine, facing horrors that no weapon could deflect. They were the nurses, women who brought a measure of humanity into landscapes built for death. On the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, German nurses struggled against both the Red Army and the elements. Men were carried in from the trenches with frost-bitten hands blackened beyond recognition, their breath shallow, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. In wooden huts converted into hospitals, the smell of gangrene mixed with the bitter smoke of burning coal. A young nurse, barely 20, wrote in her diary, "Every morning, we cut away more flesh. Every night, we bury more men." Retreat meant packing up field stations overnight, dragging supplies into horse-drawn wagons while shells burst in the distance. Across the Mediterranean, Allied nurses followed invasion forces into North Africa and Italy. They worked in canvas tents pitched on muddy fields, where blackout lamps barely pierced the darkness. Surgeons operated through air raids, oil lamps flickering as scalpels cut and sutures stitched. One nurse remembered whispering to a soldier who clutched her sleeve, "We sleep with our boots on. The bombs don't wait." The wards echoed with the groans of the wounded and the sobs of those writing last letters home, dictated to the women who steadied their trembling voices. Hospital ships became floating sanctuaries and floating targets. Painted white with great red crosses, they carried the injured across the Mediterranean and the Channel. Nurses tended to shattered limbs while scanning the horizon for U-boat wakes. Torpedoes did not discriminate between mercy and war, and when the decks shook with impact, these women dragged stretchers through smoke and flame, shielding the wounded with their own bodies. In Normandy, after D-Day, casualty clearing stations filled faster than cots could be arranged. Mud seeped into canvas, blood soaked the straw, and the cries of the newly wounded arrived each hour. Nurses worked in shifts that blurred into days, their hands raw from endless scrubbing, their uniforms stiff with sweat and iodine. They improvised with whatever they had, cutting bandages from sheets, fashioning splints from rifle stocks. Yet amid the chaos, they became more than medical staff. To many soldiers, they were sisters, mothers, and confidants, offering the comfort of a hand on the forehead or a promise to write home. The paradox of their service was unmistakable. These women were unarmed, yet they stood closer to the front than many soldiers. They saved lives in places built to end them. Their compassion was a weapon of its own, blunting despair in the very heart of destruction. But the cost of such service lingered long after the guns fell silent. Many nurses carried nightmares of screams that never ceased, of blood that never washed away, of faces they could not save. Their heroism, like that of the spies in the shadows, was not written in military victories, but in lives pulled back from the edge. Together, they sustained the war effort, not by destroying the enemy, but by keeping armies alive long enough to fight again. In their hands lay the fragile balance between survival and silence, between humanity and the abyss. As the Reich tightened its grip, defiance became both a duty and a death sentence. Women in occupied Europe, once overlooked as harmless, had already proven themselves vital to sabotage networks and underground courier lines. By 1943 and 1944, the Gestapo had begun to see them differently. No longer invisible, but lethal. In the shadows of Paris, a young courier slipped a pistol into her handbag before meeting her cell. She carried more than messages that night. She carried orders for an assassination. In Warsaw, resistance fighters disguised themselves as nurses, guiding Jewish children out of ghettos under the cover of supposed hospital transfers. Across the Netherlands, women on bicycles placed bombs beneath railway bridges, derailing supply lines bound for the Eastern Front. Their work slowed the Reich's war machine, but each act of defiance drew swift and brutal retribution. The Gestapo's response was merciless. Safe houses were raided, families rounded up, and entire villages burned in reprisal. In interrogation chambers across Europe, women were strapped to chairs under blinding lights. Survivor testimonies speak of rubber truncheons, hours of beatings, and the cold voice of the interrogator demanding names. One woman, arrested in Lyon, later recalled whispering to herself, "If I speak, more will die. If I remain silent, I may die. The choice is already made." Many who survived interrogation were deported to concentration camps like Ravensbrück, a site built to break women through starvation, exhaustion, and fear. Yet even behind barbed wire, resistance endured. Prisoners sang coded songs that carried news from one block to another. Doctors among them fashioned crude instruments to tend to the sick in secret, defying camp rules at the risk of execution. Tiny scraps of paper circulated through barracks with hidden notes, keeping alive networks of solidarity when hope seemed lost. The paradox of their struggle was stark. Though unarmed and imprisoned, these women remained a threat to Nazi control. Their resilience under torture and captivity exposed a truth the Reich could not extinguish, that the will to resist could not be silenced, even in chains. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted. The Red Army pressed westward, the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, and the Reich crumbled under the weight of its enemies. But for thousands of women in prisons and camps, liberation was still a distant dream. Each day was a gamble with death, each sunrise a fragile reprieve. Their sacrifices etched themselves into history, not only in victories won, but in the cost they bore. They carried bombs and bandages, secrets and songs, courage and fear, all under the shadow of Nazi retribution. In their defiance, they became more than silent witnesses. They became the pulse of resistance itself, proof that even in the darkest corners of Europe, the will to fight for freedom never fully died. By the spring of 1945, the sound of artillery no longer signaled only destruction. It heralded the collapse of a regime that had dragged Europe into ruin. For women who had lived the war in uniform, in shadows, or in the ruins of hospitals, its end was not a clean victory, but a new reckoning. In the streets of Paris, Prague, and Warsaw, women accused of collaboration were seized by mobs. Their hair was hacked off, their clothes torn, and they were paraded before jeering crowds. Some had carried rifles for the SS. Others had simply worked in offices or loved the wrong man. The humiliation was public, brutal, and left scars that lingered long after the cheering of liberation faded. Yet even as punishment was meted out on some, silence fell upon others. Resistance heroines, women who had smuggled weapons, organized sabotage, or endured Gestapo torture, were quickly pushed aside in the rush to rebuild nations. Their names were rarely written into the first volumes of post-war histories, overshadowed by generals and statesmen. A French courier who had carried intelligence across mine-laden fields recalled decades later, "I came home, and no one asked me what I had done. They asked only what I would cook." For nurses, the end of war did not end the screams in their minds. Many returned to homes reduced to rubble, carrying the invisible weight of years spent in triage wards. They remembered oil lamps guttering during amputations, the stench of disinfectant mixing with blood, and the pleading eyes of boys no older than their brothers. Though hailed as angels of mercy during campaigns, they found little comfort afterward. Wartime propaganda had celebrated them as heroines, yet in peacetime, governments offered neither the pensions nor recognition granted to male veterans. The Geneva Convention, drafted long before the realities of total war blurred the line between combatant and civilian, provided little clarity. Nurses were recognized as protected personnel under its statutes, but auxiliaries, clerks, Flakhelferinnen, and communication operators were not. Many were marched into captivity by Allied forces, uncertain whether they were to be treated as prisoners of war or civilian internees. Months passed in limbo behind barbed wire, their fates undecided, their identities caught in the gray zone of a world trying to measure justice. In Germany, thousands of young women returned to homes scarred by firebombs and hunger. Some had served in uniforms they no longer dared to wear. Others bore memories of captivity, interrogation, or humiliation. Most carried silence. Speaking of their service risked suspicion, even condemnation. Better to forget. Better to bury their experiences in kitchens and factory lines than to relive the war through accusing eyes. The paradox of their recognition was cruel. They had carried the war on their shoulders, bandaging wounds, decoding signals, smuggling messages, and enduring captivity. Yet, when the world wrote its memorials, their names were omitted. Nations preferred heroes in helmets, not women in aprons or bandages. Their sacrifices remained in the shadows, whispered only in memoirs, diaries, and oral histories that would surface decades later. The war had ended. But for these women, its echoes continued in silence, shame, and forgotten valor. Decades after the guns fell silent, the memories of women's hidden war lingered like smoke that refused to clear. At first, their stories lived only in whispers, diaries tucked in drawers, photographs without captions, names erased from official reports. Nations, eager to rebuild, celebrated the victories of generals and the resilience of soldiers. But the women who had carried messages, stitched wounds, or risked their lives in sabotage were left in silence. It was only in the slow march of years that their legacies began to re-emerge. Oral histories recorded in the 1970s and 80s revealed voices that had been muted for too long. Statues rose in town squares, bronze figures of nurses bent over stretchers, plaques honoring couriers who never returned, archives cataloging the shift work of women who forged shells in dim-lit factories. Institutions that once overlooked them, from the Red Cross to MI6, began to honor their service, acknowledging that without these women, the machinery of war and the architecture of resistance would have crumbled. The memory of Saint-Lô returns, dust and fire, a nurse crouching over the wounded as engines roared beyond the horizon. In occupied France, a girl pedaled her bicycle down a country lane, coded notes hidden beneath loaves of bread. In Berlin, a secretary leaned over her desk, copying figures that she would slip to Allied handlers by night. In Essen, factory workers watched through smoke-stained windows as American tanks rolled closer with every dawn. These fragments, once scattered, have become part of the collective history of the war. Their legacy is not measured in medals or parades. It is carried in the testimonies of survival and the courage to defy. One French resistor, interviewed near the end of her life, spoke simply, "We were never soldiers, but we fought because silence was worse." A German nurse, who had returned home broken and forgotten, recalled, "The war ended, but the screams did not." These words, echoing across borders, remind us that war leaves no role untouched, no life unscarred. Today, their hidden war reshapes how history remembers the fight against Hitler, not only through the tanks and bombers that crushed the Reich, but through the women who bore witness, who resisted, who healed, and who endured captivity with dignity. Their courage was not celebrated in victory parades, but it lived on in the resilience of memory. The world that collapsed under steel also revealed, in its shadows, a different kind of strength. Women who entered history as auxiliaries, helpers, or nameless figures became something greater, silent architects of survival, defiance, and testimony. Their war was fought in whispers, in bloodied wards, in secret notes, and in silence. And yet, from that silence emerged a legacy that endures, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, courage does not disappear. The engines of Saint-Lô have long gone silent, but the echoes remain.